The millionaire pays his black gardener to accompany him to a last-minute dinner and accidentally falls in love. Before we dive into the full story, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. Now, subscribe to the channel and let's get started. Daniel's phone exploded with notifications for the third time that morning. He paced back and forth in his spacious office, its floor-to-ceiling windows and modern furniture looking as though they'd never been used. His assistant's nervous voice echoed through the line. "Gabriella canceled, sir. She won't be able to accompany you tonight." Daniel stopped in the middle of the room, gripping the phone harder than he should have. "She can't." "What excuse did she give?" he asked, though he knew it didn't matter. That evening's dinner wasn't something he could miss, and he definitely couldn't attend alone. "Family issues, sir. The other options are unavailable." The assistant hesitated. "It's very last minute." Daniel took a deep breath, trying to control his tone. "I need someone, anyone. This dinner could secure the investment." Before Diane could respond, his eyes were drawn to the garden just below the window. Teresa, the gardener, was kneeling near the flower beds. She wore simple, worn clothes with muddy rubber boots and a scarf holding back her hair. Her steady hands adjusted the flower stems with care, as though the world outside didn't exist. Daniel disliked improvising, but the clock seemed to scream in his ear. He lowered the phone and walked outside. The morning sun lit up Teresa's figure as she worked. Her fingers, marked by soil and daily labor, moved with precision, pulling dry leaves and watering newly placed plants. When she heard footsteps approaching, she looked up. Daniel stopped a few feet away, standing tall in his immaculate suit, which always seemed out of place near the grass. "Teresa, I need to speak with you." She frowned, wiping her hands on a cloth hanging from her pocket. "What is it, sir?" Daniel hesitated, choosing his words. The image of him, so poised and anxious, seemed even more out of place than usual. "I have a proposal for you." She stood up, brushing her dirty knees and tilting her head, clearly skeptical. "A proposal?" The word came out with a mix of surprise and suspicion. "My date for a business dinner canceled. I need someone with me. Tonight." The words came out harsher than he intended, as though forcing something inside himself. Teresa blinked slowly, as if she couldn't believe what she'd heard. "Excuse me, sir, but are you serious?" Daniel ran a hand over his face. "I know it's strange. It's an unusual situation. But I'm out of options. I'll pay well. I just need you there to accompany me. It's important." She crossed her arms, looking him up and down with an expression that mixed humor and exasperation. "And why me?" "Because you're here," he replied without thinking. The silence that followed only made the awkwardness worse. Teresa let out a heavy sigh. "I take care of the garden, sir. I know how to trim trees, plant roses, and keep the grass perfect. I'm not the kind who goes to gala events." Daniel felt the pressure building in his chest. "I'm not asking you to be someone else. Just to come with me. It won't last long, just a few hours." She narrowed her eyes, her face serious. "And what do you expect me to do there? Pretend to be someone I'm not? Smile at people who'll look at me like I'm invisible?" Daniel shrugged. "I expect you to be yourself. Nothing more." The answer caught Teresa off guard. She bit her lower lip, her gaze drifting to the flower beds. The proposal was absurd, of course, but something in Daniel's voice sounded almost desperate. And maybe, just maybe, she was tired of being the gardener, whom no one noticed. How much? she asked finally, her voice firm. Daniel let out a relieved sigh, enough to make it worth it. She shook her head slowly, her gaze still wary. I'll think about it. I'm not promising anything. We don't have time to think, Teresa. I need an answer now. The wind blew lightly, rustling the leaves around them. Teresa looked at the flower beds, then at her soil-stained hands. Something inside her whispered to say yes. Perhaps it was curiosity, or just the desire to prove she could be more than everyone expected. All right, but don't think this is going to be easy, sir. Daniel nodded, almost surprised at her positive response. I'll make sure you have everything you need. Address, transportation, whatever it takes. Teresa raised an eyebrow, a sarcastic smile tugging at one corner of her lips. I hope you don't regret this, sir. He didn't respond, just nodded before turning and heading back into the house. In the small room at the back of the mansion, Teresa opened the simple wardrobe where she kept her clothes. Among worn work pieces, a long black dress hung alone, covered in a thin layer of dust. She held it by the straps, feeling the rough fabric between her fingers. A dress bought long ago, saved for an occasion that never came. The mirror reflected the face of a woman who looked tired but determined. Teresa stared at her reflection for a moment, as if searching for something hidden within herself. She took a deep breath and began to get ready. Meanwhile, Daniel adjusted his tie in the mirror of his closet, his expression heavy with concern. Doubts began to weigh on him. Taking Teresa to the dinner could be a colossal mistake. But now, there was no turning back. In the house's main hall, he heard footsteps coming from the hallway. Turning, he saw Teresa standing at the entrance. The black dress fell simply yet elegantly, paired with small earrings and hair pulled back tightly. She looked different, still herself, but with a quiet strength he couldn't ignore. "Ready?" Daniel asked, masking his discomfort. Teresa lifted her chin, her voice firm. "Let's show them we're not so different." Daniel observed her for a moment, intrigued. Then he extended his arm, and together they walked out to face the night. In the rearview mirror, Daniel sees Teresa's reflection, serious and focused. He wonders, will she surprise him in some way? Aqui está a tradução para o inglês. The silence hung heavy in the mansion as Teresa observed the dress in the mirror. It was simple, black, with a straight cut that left her shoulders bare. She touched the fabric carefully, still feeling the strangeness of the situation. This wasn't just any night. Not for her. Daniel wanted her to behave, to follow the script, but discomfort pulsed through every part of her body. Upstairs, Daniel wrestled with his tie. His agile hands, which signed million-dollar contracts without hesitation, trembled as he adjusted the knot in the mirror. The eyes reflected back at him looked tired, tense. Not because of the event, he could handle that, but Teresa's presence that night brought an unpredictability that unsettled him. In the hallway, the sound of footsteps made Daniel turn his head. He descended the stairs slowly and found Teresa standing in the entrance, waiting. She had pinned her hair into a simple bun, revealing her long neck and a natural elegance that came effortlessly. Her hands, steady, held a small purse. "Don't look at me like that," Teresa muttered, noticing his fixed gaze. "You look like you're about to faint." Daniel cleared his throat, embarrassed. "Sorry. You look great." His voice sounded almost surprised. Teresa raised an eyebrow, skeptical. For someone who was pulling weeds out of the ground a few hours ago, I guess I'm not bad, am I? A brief smile escaped, but he quickly composed himself. We can't be late. The driver's waiting. They walked through the main door together. The night air was cooler than expected, and Teresa took a deep breath, as if she needed to fill her lungs with courage. As they walked to the black car waiting for them, Daniel noticed her calm pace, as though she was in no rush at all. I know this sounds absurd, but I need tonight to go well, he murmured, opening the car door for her. I know it's not fair to ask this of you, but… Teresa entered the car without responding. She simply observed him out of the corner of her eye as he settled in beside her and closed the door. When the car started moving, silence settled between them. And what exactly do you expect from me there? Teresa asked, breaking the stillness. Daniel turned his gaze from the window and met hers, firm and direct. That you be comfortable. You don't have to talk much, just… Don't let me look like an idiot. Oh, so I'm a shield against your idiocy. She laughed softly, an unexpected sound that seemed to relax his tense shoulders. I'm joking, sir. But I'll warn you now, I'm not good at being decorative. You don't have to be, just be yourself, he replied sincerely, though he wasn't quite sure what that meant. Teresa studied him for a moment, almost surprised by the genuine tone. Then she turned her gaze back outside. The elegant streets of the city center paraded past the windows, and she noticed the displays of expensive shops, the bright lights, a world she had never belonged to. You know, I used to tend gardens in places like this, she said, almost to herself. Big mansions, luxury hotels. Everyone passes by without looking at the flowers. They're just the backdrop for pretty pictures. Daniel frowned, intrigued. Does that bother you? No, it just makes me think. The most beautiful things are always the ones people ignore. He stayed silent, her words echoing in his mind. Maybe she wasn't just talking about flowers. Suddenly, the car braked sharply. Daniel gripped the seat, irritated. What was that? He asked. The driver mumbled something about unexpected traffic. Daniel glanced at his watch and frowned. Great, as if we weren't already late. Teresa smirked, noticing his nervousness. The world won't end if we arrive 5 minutes later. Maybe your world, not mine, he replied curtly. She sighed and leaned forward, resting her arm on the back of the seat. Can I tell you something? When I'm late, I like to think the universe is just giving me extra time to prepare. Daniel looked at her, a little less rigid. And do you really believe that? Sometimes, yes. Sometimes I just pretend to believe it. She shrugged. But in the end, we always arrive when we're supposed to. He smiled involuntarily, relaxing a little. The car finally began to move again, and the bright lights of an elegant hotel appeared ahead. The place was imposing, with a lit entrance and a line of luxury cars dropping off their guests. Daniel swallowed hard, as if reality had just hit him. Are you ready? He asked, turning to Teresa. She adjusted the scarf, holding her bun, and took a deep breath. Let's see if I'm as good at this as I am in the garden. The driver stopped the car, and a valet opened the door. Teresa stepped out first, raising her chin to face the hotel without hesitation. Daniel followed closely behind, straightening his posture and jacket. As they walked side by side on the red carpet, he realized that, even wearing the simplest dress of the evening, Teresa seemed to be the most confident person there. She noticed the stares, felt the heads turning and the whispers starting before they even reached the entrance. But she didn't let it shake her. Instead, she turned to Daniel, leaned slightly toward him, and whispered with a nearly defiant smile, "Remember what I said. Let's show them we're not so different." Daniel paused for a second, impressed by her calm. Then he nodded, adjusted his tie, and walked on, prepared, or almost, for what was to come. As he spotted the entrance full of elegant guests, Daniel felt a chill in his stomach, while Teresa took a deep breath. Determined. The city seemed noisier that night, or perhaps it was just the tense silence inside the car that made everything sound amplified. Teresa watched the scenery through the window, the lights from shops and street lamps creating reflections that danced in her attentive eyes. Daniel, at the wheel, looked too focused, his hands steady on the steering wheel and his gaze fixed on the traffic ahead. For a while, neither of them said anything. The silence was almost comfortable, but far too heavy to last. "Are you nervous?" Teresa asked suddenly, her soft voice cutting through the heavy atmosphere. Daniel shifted his eyes from the road for a second, surprised by the question. "No, I mean, maybe a little. But I can't afford to be." "Yeah, I noticed. You look like a pressure cooker," she replied, tilting her head to look at him more closely. "You're going to explode before we even get there." A wry smile escaped him despite the nerves. "Believe me, tonight has no room for explosions. I need everything to go well." Teresa nodded, looking out the window again. "And why all this nervousness? It's just a dinner, right?" "It's not just a dinner." Daniel adjusted his tie with one hand, the gesture mechanical. "The investor who will be there, he doesn't do business easily. A single misstep could cost months of work. So you picked me to be the perfect piece in this presentation." She shot back, sarcasm thick in her voice. Daniel sighed. "I picked you because I had no one else." His honesty made her raise an eyebrow. What a compliment. "I'll hold that close to my heart. That's not what I meant," he replied, almost laughing. "It's just that, despite everything, I trust you won't let me down." Teresa smiled faintly, but didn't respond. She knew she hadn't been the first choice, not even the 10th, and she didn't want to be. Still, something about that night made her want to prove she was more than the gardener. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was a quiet desire to be seen. Traffic started to build up as soon as they entered one of the main avenues. Cars honked impatiently, while Daniel gripped the wheel tighter, muttering something unintelligible. "Relax. It'll pass," said Teresa, looking at the sluggish flow of vehicles. "I can't be late," he replied, glancing at his watch. "Wow, that tie really is choking you," she teased, trying to lighten the mood. Daniel shot her a sideways look, but for the first time that night, a laugh escaped him. "Do you always have a joke ready?" "Only when I'm with people who look on the verge of a meltdown," she replied, a mischievous smile on her lips. The car crawled forward, but not fast enough for Daniel's liking. He rolled down the window, letting the cool air sweep into the car and blow through Teresa's loose strands of hair. She closed her eyes for a moment, savoring it. "You should do that more often," she said. "Do what?" "Breathe. It's free, you know? Good for your mind." Daniel laughed again, but this time the sound seemed lighter. "Have you always been this philosophical? Only around those who need to hear it." She opened her eyes and looked at him, amusement twinkling in her gaze. He shook his head, but felt calmer, as if the weight on his shoulders had eased a little. Shortly after, the GPS announced that the route had changed. A detour forced them through narrower streets, off the planned path. Daniel let out a frustrated exclamation and hit the wheel. "I can't believe this." "Calm down," Teresa said, looking around. At least the car is still moving. The detour took them through a humbler neighborhood, with older houses and dimmer streets. Teresa looked out the window, a nostalgic smile forming on her lips. "I grew up in a place like this," she said quietly. Daniel glanced at her from the corner of his eye, intrigued. "Really?" "Yeah. A small house with a yard full of plants my grandmother cared for. That's where I learned to love flowers. She used to say plants teach us patience, that everything grows in its own time." Teresa paused and let out a soft laugh. "I don't know why I'm telling you this." "No, keep going," Daniel replied, more curious than he expected. "It's interesting." She smiled and looked away. "There's nothing much to it. I just miss it sometimes. The simplicity. That time when the world felt less complicated." Daniel fell silent, thinking about what she said. He never thought about simplicity. His life had been a frantic sequence of goals, commitments, and numbers. There was no room to look back, let alone remember something simpler. The GPS finally guided them back to the main road. The hotel appeared ahead, grand and brightly lit, its windows reflecting the night sky. Daniel slowed the car as they approached the entrance. "We're here," he murmured, adjusting his tie. Teresa looked at the imposing building. Elegant cars and guests in expensive clothes moved through the main doors. She took a deep breath, preparing herself. "There's still time to turn back," she joked, masking her nerves. "No turning back now," Daniel replied, though his own heart seemed to beat faster. The car stopped, and the valet opened the passenger door. Teresa stepped out first, her simple dress standing out against the exaggerated shine of gowns and jewelry around her. Daniel followed quickly, looking more composed than he felt. As they walked toward the entrance, Teresa whispered, her voice soft but resolute, "Let's show them we're not so different." Daniel paused for a brief second, surprised by her calm. Then he nodded, straightened his posture, and moved forward, ready, or almost, for whatever the night had in store. Daniel parks and cue before stepping out of the car. Teresa whispers, "Let's show them we're not so different." Intrigued, Daniel opens the door. The social game is about to begin. Aqui está a tradução para o inglês. The door to the ballroom opened with a muffled, almost ceremonial sound, as Daniel offered his arm to Teresa. She hesitated only for a moment before accepting, touching him with the same delicacy she used when handling the most fragile petals in the garden. A stark contrast between her simplicity and the opulent brilliance that dominated the room. The hotel ballroom looked as if it had come straight out of a classic painting. Crystal chandeliers hung from the high ceiling, spreading a golden light that glimmered on the guests' jewelry. The air was thick with expensive perfume and the soft strains of a string quartet playing in the background. Teresa took a deep breath and kept her chin lifted, ignoring the gazes that swept over her like a clinical examination. Beside her, Daniel paused briefly, observing the heads that turned in their direction. He pressed her arm lightly, a subtle gesture, but Teresa noticed. "He's nervous," she thought, which made her smile faintly. An elegantly dressed hostess approached, her professional smile not reaching her eyes. She looked Teresa up and down for a moment that stretched a second too long before turning to Daniel. "Good evening, Mr. Lancaster. It's a pleasure to have you with us again." "Good evening," Daniel responded, polite but firm. "This is my companion, Teresa." The hostess made a visible effort to hide her surprise. Her lips curled into a forced smile, and she nodded quickly. "Welcome. The other guests have already arrived." As the hostess walked away, Teresa exchanged a glance with Daniel. I think I earned points for her reaction, she thought, but said nothing. Instead, she lifted her head and walked with him to the heart of the ballroom. The murmurs started almost immediately. Teresa didn't need to be paranoid to hear the muffled whispers, to notice the curious stares and others that were clearly disapproving. An older woman with silver hair, draped in a bright blue dress, stared for a moment long enough to make Teresa want to look down. She didn't. I wish these people would just take their pictures already, Teresa murmured, leaning toward Daniel. Then they could go back to pretending I don't exist. Daniel pressed his lips to stifle a laugh. Ignore them. They have nothing better to do. Oh, I'm ignoring them. But if you want the plants in your garden to survive, I suggest hiring someone to take care of these people. They look quite withered. Daniel smiled subtly, but didn't respond. He had to keep his composure. They moved toward a small circle where a few well-known businessmen and their wives stood, all dressed in accordance with the event's dress code: luxury and formality. As they approached, Daniel adopted the tone he always used in these settings, a firm, neutral voice filled with confidence. Good evening, everyone. The group turned simultaneously, their expressions softening upon recognizing Daniel, but freezing again as they noticed Teresa at his side. Daniel, what a surprise, said an older man in an impeccable suit, his expression curious. And who is? This is Teresa, Daniel answered without hesitation. My companion this evening? The silence that followed was brief but palpable. The man's wife, a woman with a plastered smile, looked at Teresa with a mixture of curiosity and judgment. And what do you do, Teresa? She asked, in that overly sweet tone that disguised her true intent. Teresa remained calm, her gaze steady. I take care of Daniel's estate gardens. Plants, flowers, trees, anything that breathes and grows. The woman blinked, confused by the straightforward response. Daniel seemed to hold his breath, but Teresa kept her posture, smiling softly. How interesting, the woman replied, clearly at a loss for words. Daniel quickly shifted the conversation, steering it toward the expected foreign investor, as if nothing had happened. Teresa, however, could feel the furtive glances as the group slowly dispersed. They're testing me, she thought. But I won't break. Can I get you something to drink? Daniel asked after a while, his voice low. Water, please, Teresa replied. Nothing stronger? Better to keep my head clear. I'm already out of my natural habitat. I don't want to trip over a table. Daniel smiled faintly and signaled a waiter, who brought a glass of water. As Teresa took a sip, she noticed a group of women in the background whispering and looking in her direction. One of them, an elegant blonde, finally worked up the nerve and walked toward them. Mr. Lancaster, she called in an overly enthusiastic tone. It's so good to see you here. Daniel smiled politely, but Teresa saw the discomfort in his eyes. The woman wasted no time and looked directly at her. You look familiar, the blonde said, tilting her head slightly. Ah, of course. I knew I recognized you. Aren't you his gardener? The already quiet ballroom seemed to grow even more silent. Teresa felt her blood boil, but remained calm. She straightened a little more and replied with a controlled smile. I tend to the gardens, yes. It's an honorable job, in case you were wondering. The woman opened a cold smile, but couldn't muster a response. Daniel finally intervened. Teresa is more than that, he said firmly. She's someone I trust, and what matters is that she's here with me tonight. His words, though simple, carried the necessary weight. The blonde retreated, murmuring something vague before walking away. Teresa glanced at Daniel sideways, surprised by his intervention. "That was unexpected," she murmured. "You're handling this better than I thought," he replied with a half-smile. "Maybe you don't actually need my help tonight." She smiled back, though she still felt the weight of the stares around them. Daniel was right. This was only the beginning, and the worst was yet to come. A murmur ripples through the ballroom. The investor has just arrived. Teresa and Daniel brace themselves for the decisive confrontation. Teresa felt the weight of the stairs as she walked beside Daniel toward the main table. The hall was even quieter now, with the discreet murmurs of the guests giving way to the clinking of glasses and the soft music from the quartet in the background. Daniel was focused, his expression closed off as if trying to shield himself against any surprises. As for her, even in the simplest attire of the night, she walked with the posture of someone who knew exactly where she stood. Upon reaching the table, the investor, a middle-aged man with a stern expression and watchful eyes, lifted his face, observing the two of them with restrained interest. His presence radiated authority, and Daniel wasted no time. "Mr. Muller, good evening. It's a pleasure to see you again," Daniel said, shaking the man's firm hand. "Lancaster." Muller nodded with a faint smile, but his attention quickly shifted to Teresa. "And who might this young lady be?" "Teresa," Daniel answered before she could speak. "My companion this evening." Teresa extended her hand with a polite smile. "Teresa Costa." "It's a pleasure, Mr. Muller." The investor's eyes narrowed slightly as he greeted her. "The pleasure is mine." As they settled in, Teresa noticed the gazes around the table, laden with curiosity and, in some cases, thinly veiled disdain. A waiter began serving the first course, and conversations slowly resumed, though whispers about her still echoed faintly in the background. The first attack came too quickly. "So, Teresa," began a gray-haired man with a sharp smile, "what brings you to such an important dinner?" Teresa placed her napkin on her lap and lifted her gaze to him, steady but calm. "Daniel's invitation, naturally." "Naturally," the man repeated with a dry laugh, as if expecting another answer. "I imagine you're familiar with events like this?" Daniel opened his mouth to intervene, but Teresa was quicker. "I imagine no one is ever completely familiar with an environment where everyone looks at each other like pieces on a chessboard," she replied with a polished smile. "But I'm adapting." The man blinked, clearly surprised, and the faint chuckles from other guests quickly turned to silence. Daniel looked at Teresa, admiring her quick response and the confidence with which she delivered it. The following courses arrived, accompanied by discussions about business, investments, and economic forecasts. Teresa remained quiet most of the time, observing. She didn't understand the technical details, but she could see what was happening. The power play among these people was as sharp as the silver knives in their hands. Every word seemed measured, every smile false. "I imagine you enjoy exotic plants," said an elegant woman to Teresa's left, her tone far too sweet to be sincere. "Gardens and flowers, right? Simple things." Teresa lifted her eyes, not losing her composure. "Plants are more complex than people think. They need the right environment to grow, constant care. It's not so different from what we do in life, don't you think?" The woman smiled awkwardly and looked away. Daniel watched the scene silently, more attentive than he appeared. He was used to facing opponents in meetings, but there was something about Teresa that made those veiled attacks bounce back at their attackers like a mirror. That's when Clarissa arrived. Daniel's ex-wife entered the hall as though she owned the place. She wore a shimmering red dress, and the ironic smile on her lips left no doubt that her presence was calculated. When she spotted Daniel and Teresa at the table, her eyes gleamed like those of a predator. "Well, Daniel," she said as she approached, completely ignoring the others at the table. "What a surprise to find you here." "Clarissa," he replied, polite but cold. Clarissa leaned slightly, giving Teresa a look that assessed her from head to toe. "And you must be—" "Teresa," she replied firmly. "And you?" The response drew a crooked smile from Clarissa, as if she couldn't believe what she had just heard. "Clarissa? Daniel's ex-wife," she replied, spinning the word ex like a sharp knife. "But you already knew that, didn't you?" Teresa didn't answer. She didn't need to. Silence was sometimes the most powerful response. "Daniel, I must admit you really know how to surprise. I always thought you were above social experiments," Clarissa said, her voice low but loud enough for the entire table to hear. Teresa felt her blood boil, but kept herself upright, her gaze fixed on Clarissa. Daniel, however, couldn't hold back. "I don't see why my life is still any of your concern, Clarissa," he said firmly. Clarissa laughed softly, as though nothing could affect her. "Don't take offense, dear," she continued, looking at Teresa. "I just find your courage admirable. It can't be easy to be here." Teresa calmly placed her fork down and looked directly into Clarissa's eyes. "Actually, it's not difficult. You just have to remember that, in the end, everyone is equal when they stand on the earth. Some just take longer to realize it." The response silenced Clarissa for a second. Daniel looked at Teresa as though seeing her for the first time. The silence returned to the table, broken only by the faint clinking of glasses at other tables. Muller, the investor, who had been silent until now, watched everything intently. Clarissa smiled coolly, as if she had lost interest. "Enjoy your dinner." And she walked away, leaving behind a trace of her expensive perfume. Daniel leaned slightly toward Teresa, speaking softly. "Thank you." "It wasn't for you," she replied with a half-smile. "I'm not the kind to bow my head." Daniel smiled too, finally relaxing a little. For the first time that evening, he felt he had a true ally. The dinner continued, but the air felt heavier. Muller, the investor, looked at Daniel with renewed interest, as though studying his every move. Teresa knew the night was far from over. At the end of the main dinner, Clarissa whispers to Daniel that he will lose the deal. Teresa overhears this veiled threat, and her eyes narrow, determined to prove otherwise. Dinner had ended, but the night was far from over. The guests began dispersing into a side hall, where drinks were served and more informal conversations unfolded. The atmosphere was grand and luxurious, but there was something looser about it. Fewer rules, more space for masks to fall. Teresa walked a few steps behind Daniel, her hands folded over her simple dress. She still felt the weight of the humiliation caused by Clarissa at the table, but she didn't let it show. She had learned, over time, that dignity was the one thing no one could take from her. While Daniel greeted a small group of acquaintances, Teresa discreetly stepped away. She didn't want to be his shadow, nor did she want to appear as if she needed protection. She approached a large window overlooking the hotel's illuminated garden. Outside, the leaves of the trees swayed under the night wind, and for a moment, she allowed herself to breathe. "You look out of place, dear," said a voice behind her, cold as metal. Teresa turned slowly and found a middle-aged man in an expensive suit. wearing a venomous smile. He held a glass of wine and looked at her as if she were an insect on his dinner table. "Excuse me," she replied, her tone neutral but firm. "I'm just curious," he continued, swirling the wine glass slowly. "How much were you paid to play this role tonight?" Teresa felt the blood rush to her face, but she remained upright. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Of course you do. We all do." He smiled, a gesture false and cruel. "Daniel Lancaster may be many things, but sentimental he is not. I imagine you were well paid to pose as his companion. I must say, he was creative this time." Teresa took a deep breath, every muscle in her body begging to react. But she didn't shout, didn't cry. When she finally spoke, her voice was sharp as a blade. "I didn't realize the guest's imagination was part of tonight's entertainment." His smile faltered for a moment, but quickly returned, even more insufferable. A bold response. "But you know as well as I do that you don't belong here." Teresa opened her mouth to retort, but another voice echoed behind them, louder and full of restrained anger. "Enough!" Daniel had appeared, his face red and fists clenched. He looked at the man with contempt. "I won't tolerate this kind of behavior, especially not toward someone here at my invitation." "Oh, Daniel, don't be so dramatic," the man said, raising his hands as if he were innocent. "Just making an observation. Call it what you will." Daniel took a step forward, his voice low and grave. "Teresa is my guest and deserves the same respect as anyone else in this room. If you can't handle that, the door is right there." The silence around them was heavy. Some guests had stopped their conversations and were watching the scene with curiosity. Clarissa, standing in the background, smiled with satisfaction, as though she were watching a spectacle she herself had orchestrated. Teresa, however, didn't appear grateful. She turned to Daniel, her gaze steady. "I don't need you to defend me," she said, her tone low but clear enough to be heard. "I know how to protect myself." Daniel stared at her, surprised. "I know you do, but I won't let this slide." She shook her head and stepped back slightly. "That's the problem. You think you can solve everything by shouting louder than everyone else? Sometimes silence is stronger." Daniel opened his mouth to respond, but closed it when he realized she wasn't wrong. Teresa turned back to the man who had insulted her, her eyes shining with calm ferocity. "I'll say this only once. Don't underestimate me. I've planted roots in far harsher grounds than this one." The man didn't reply. He averted his gaze, pretending to ignore her words, but the embarrassment on his face was obvious. Teresa then turned and walked to the other side of the hall, leaving Daniel standing there, still processing what had happened. Clarissa, who had been watching the scene from afar, approached Daniel. She placed a light hand on his arm, her touch cold as ice. "What a show, darling," she said, smiling. "Are you really going to throw your reputation away over a gardener?" "Get out of here, Clarissa," he replied, not looking at her. "No need to be so irritable. I'm just worried about you." She leaned in closer, whispering, "You're losing control, and the investor is watching everything. Will he really trust someone who can't even maintain a well-staged farce?" Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, trying to compose himself. When he opened them again, Clarissa was already walking away, the triumphant smile still on her face. Meanwhile, Teresa walked to a small table where a waiter was arranging drinks. She asked for a glass of water and watched the room, her breathing still controlled but her heart pounding in her chest. She felt the stares, The murmurs, the muffled laughter. It was like being back on her first day of work, when no one believed she could turn Daniel's garden into something beautiful. She took a sip of the water and breathed deeply. "I won't break," she promised herself. In the distance, she saw Daniel being called over by the investor, who gestured toward a side door. Daniel cast a glance toward Teresa, but said nothing before following him. She stayed where she was, but the worry grew in her chest. The hall remained crowded, but Teresa had never felt so alone. The investor quietly approaches and asks Daniel to join him in a private room. Teresa stays behind, worried. What comes next? The muffled sound of the doors closing behind Daniel made the world feel smaller. The private room had soft lighting, polished wooden walls, and a modest table between him and the investor, Müller. Sitting across from him, Müller neither smiled nor moved much. Like a statue waiting for some revelation, his steady, scrutinizing gaze hovered over Daniel, analyzing every invisible detail he might give away. Daniel adjusted himself in the chair, trying to maintain composure, but he felt the weight of the night on his shoulders. The silence dragged on until Müller finally spoke. "Who is she, Daniel?" The question was direct, with no pretense, and it hit Daniel like a blow. He knew this conversation was coming, but he hadn't expected the investor to start with such coldness. "Teresa," he answered, without hesitation. "She works with me. She tends to my gardens." Müller raised an eyebrow, his expression unchanging, but his eyes narrowed slightly. "Your gardener?" He said the word with a weight that seemed to sink the room. "And you thought it appropriate to bring her to a night like this?" Daniel swallowed hard, carefully choosing his words. Her invitation was a last-minute decision. "But I brought her because I trust her." Müller leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped on the table. "Trust? Interesting." He paused, his gaze piercing through Daniel. "So tell me, was it an act of trust or a desperate performance? A charade to try and impress someone like me?" Daniel felt his heart beat faster but took a deep breath. He knew this was his chance, perhaps the only one, to prove he wasn't the man Clarissa and the others painted him to be. "It wasn't a charade," he answered firmly. "Teresa is intelligent, dedicated, and genuine. More genuine than anyone you'll find in this room." Müller didn't respond immediately. He just kept watching, as though waiting for Daniel to continue speaking. And he did. "Tonight, Mr. Müller, I made mistakes. It may look like I brought her on impulse, but what she brought to this event and to my life was something I've needed for a long time. The truth. The people here play roles so well, they don't even know who they are anymore. Teresa doesn't need that." Müller studied him for another moment, then leaned back in his chair. "So, you value her?" he asked, almost casually. Daniel hesitated for just an instant, but the answer came from the depths of his heart. "Yes, and I should have realized it sooner." The investor remained silent, his face still indecipherable. Finally, he let out a sigh, as if tired of all the games the event seemed to demand. "I still don't know if you believe what you're saying or if you've just learned to fake it better than the others," Müller said, his voice low and grave. "But one thing I know, the best decisions are born outside of comfort. Let's see how this ends." Before Daniel could respond, Müller stood up and left the room, leaving him alone with his thoughts. Meanwhile, in the main hall, Teresa stood near one of the windows, observing the movement around her. The sound of laughter and voices blended with the music still playing, creating a chaotic backdrop that didn't match the silent storm in her mind. "Do you need anything else?" a waiter asked, approaching with a tray. Teresa offered a small smile and shook her head. "Just a little piece, if you can offer that." The young man smiled sincerely and continued his path among the guests. But it was what he said to a nearby colleague that captured her attention. "The investor, Mr. Muller, is here for that environmental project. Yes, sustainability, large green spaces." Teresa froze, her heart accelerating. Sustainable projects. She knew exactly what that meant. She remembered mornings spent reading old articles, magazines about landscaping and green spaces, techniques that could change the future. "Is that his investment?" she thought, and her gaze went straight to the room where Daniel and Muller had disappeared minutes before. The noise around her disappeared for a moment as the pieces fit together in her mind. That was it. Daniel didn't know, but she did. That was the key. Teresa took a deep breath, her chest filling with new determination. It didn't matter what they thought of her. It didn't matter the looks, the harsh words, or the whispers behind her back. If there was something she could do, it was to help. Before she realized it, her legs were already in motion, walking toward the private room. Her instinct screamed at her to stop, but she ignored it. She approached the door with firm steps, pausing only when she caught fragments of the conversation between Daniel and Muller. "Would you give her a voice in your business?" Muller asked, with that low and relentless voice. Daniel's silence was brief, but Teresa caught his nervousness. She leaned closer to the door, her heart pounding. "Yes," Daniel finally answered, "and I should have done it sooner." Teresa stood still, surprised. There was sincerity there. There was something more. She straightened up and took a deep breath, letting the conversation continue uninterrupted. Muller seemed to be testing Daniel, but Teresa knew what he wanted, and she knew what she needed to do. A few minutes later, Daniel emerged from the room, his shoulders tense and his gaze distant. He didn't seem to notice Teresa in the background, but she saw him. She noticed the weight he carried, but she also saw something else in his eyes, a glimmer of hope. As he walked back into the hall, she approached slowly and called his name. Daniel stopped and turned to her, surprised. "Teresa? What is it?" She looked directly into his eyes and said, with the confidence of someone who had just found the missing piece, "I think I know what he wants to hear." Daniel returns to the hall and finds Teresa with a spark in her eyes. She approaches and says, "I think I know what he wants to hear." Aqui está a tradução do texto. Daniel walked beside Teresa, his gaze steady as they crossed the crowded hall. Her words still echoed in his mind. "I think I know what he wants to hear." For the first time that night, he felt there was a chance, however small, to turn things around. "Are you sure?" he murmured, leaning closer so only she could hear. "Trust me," Teresa replied, her voice calm yet filled with conviction. "I know what I'm talking about." Daniel nodded, still hesitant, but there was no time for doubt. Muller was a meticulous man, and he couldn't afford another mistake. Teresa didn't seem hesitant. On the contrary, she walked with a purpose that defied every sideways glance thrown her way. Clarissa watched everything from afar, a cold smile dancing on her lips. She had already noticed that Teresa was more than just an improvised companion. She didn't like it. She didn't like how Daniel seemed different. It was as if something in him had changed since he entered that hall. Clarissa couldn't allow the night to end with Daniel at an advantage. He needed to lose, and Teresa would be the perfect means to that end. "There he is," said Teresa, nodding subtly toward Muller, who was speaking with two other businessmen near an old fireplace. Daniel took a deep breath. "Let's go." They approached with determined steps, Teresa at his side as an equal. When they arrived, Muller looked up, shifting his attention from the other men. His eyes glimmered with something between curiosity and challenge. "Ah, Lancaster. You've returned," he said, his tone neutral but heavy with expectation. Daniel smiled, forcing a confidence he didn't feel. "Mr. Muller, I hope you don't mind, but my companion wanted to share an idea with you. I thought it would be worth hearing." Muller turned his gaze to Teresa, evaluating her once more. There was a hint of skepticism in his expression, but he gestured for her to speak. "I'm listening," he said curtly. Teresa stepped forward, her hands relaxed at her sides. Her gaze was steady, her voice unwavering. "You're looking for sustainable projects, aren't you? Something that combines innovation and environmental commitment." Muller raised an eyebrow. "Perhaps. I'm sure you've already heard ideas that are too grand, too expensive, and promise unrealistic solutions," Teresa continued. "Sure, but the truth is, sustainability doesn't have to be complicated. It just needs to be practical. And who better to understand that than someone who works with the land every day?" A low murmur rose between the two men beside Muller, but he lifted a hand to silence them. His eyes never left Teresa's. "Continue." "I believe the project you're looking for can be based on regenerative landscaping principles," she explained. "The use of native plants, natural water control, and the preservation of soil biodiversity. Land can be transformed into true living ecosystems that don't just exist, but give back to nature what they take." Daniel looked at Teresa, surprised by her confidence. This was the Teresa he saw in the garden, caring for plants with knowledge and passion. But he had never really stopped to listen. "This reduces costs in the long term and creates real impact," she continued. "It's not about marketing. It's about commitment. People feel that when they step into such a space, and more importantly, the planet feels it too." For a moment, no one said anything. The silence around them felt almost sacred, as if everyone were holding their breath. Finally, Muller leaned slightly forward, his fingers touching his chin. "And you, Miss Teresa, where did you learn all of this?" "Because I live it," she replied. "I'm a gardener. I work with the land. I read, study, and learn every day. I know it's possible because I've done it, even if on a smaller scale." Muller looked at Daniel, who simply nodded. "It's an interesting idea," Muller said at last. "Simple, but interesting." Sometimes, the simplest ideas are the hardest to see," Teresa replied with a faint smile. Muller smiled as well, as if her response had surprised him. Before he could say anything else, a voice rose behind them. "I can't believe this," said Clarissa, with an exaggeratedly dramatic tone. "What a wonderful scene!" Teresa turned slowly, seeing Clarissa approach with calculated steps, her red dress gleaming under the hall's lights. Daniel stiffened beside her, sensing the imminent attack. "Clarissa, what do you want?" he asked, irritated. "I'm just curious," she replied with a cold smile. "You brought a gardener as a sustainability expert. How interesting. Isn't this just a pretty story to impress Mr. Muller?" The venom in her words made the two businessmen behind Muller exchange uncomfortable glances. Teresa remained calm, though she felt the weight of humiliation hanging in the air. "It's not a story," Daniel replied, his voice controlled but firm. "Teresa knows more about this subject than anyone in this room, and she just proved it." "Proved?" Clarissa let out a dry laugh. Because honestly, what she said sounded like a school botany lesson. Don't you think so, Mr. Miller? Miller didn't reply immediately. His gaze shifted between Clarissa, Teresa, and Daniel, his face unreadable. Perhaps it's enough, Miller finally said, his voice serious. Sometimes the most valuable lessons come from those who truly know the ground they walk on. Clarissa blinked, surprised, but quickly tried to recover. Of course, just an observation. Nothing more. She shot Daniel a cold look and stepped away, though not without whispering into his ear. This won't end well. You know that. She left, trailing the strong scent of perfume and unspoken barbs. Daniel let out a heavy sigh, as if he were freeing himself from a burden. Teresa looked at him seriously. She can't hurt you anymore if you stop giving her space. Daniel stared at her for a moment, absorbing her words. Before he could reply, Miller cleared his throat, drawing their attention. Let's talk about this idea, Daniel, he said, looking at Teresa with respect. It seems your companion has something valuable to offer. Daniel's heart gave a discreet leap, but he remained composed. Teresa smiled faintly, feeling she had won a silent battle. The atmosphere is bleak. Daniel watches everything crumble, and the figure of Teresa walking away through the hall. Hurt. The investor heads for the exit. Is this the end? The ballroom seemed to spin around Daniel. Clarissa's voice echoed in his mind, mingled with Miller's stern gaze and the distant sound of clinking glasses. Teresa was no longer there. He had seen her expression, the frustration, the exhaustion, the disappointment, before she disappeared through the empty lobby. The investor, Mueller, was now standing, adjusting his coat as if preparing to leave. Daniel felt the weight of failure settle on his shoulders. The entire evening had crumbled into a series of poor choices, unspoken words, and wasted opportunities. He didn't need to hear Mueller say that the deal was lost. It was obvious. It was a good attempt, Lancaster, Mueller said, in a neutral, almost bored tone. But it seems something is still missing. Daniel opened his mouth, searching for a response, but nothing came. There was no way to salvage that moment. Mueller cast one last glance around the room, then walked toward the exit. Daniel remained frozen, as if the ground beneath his feet had become unstable. Then, without thinking, he moved. "Damn it," he muttered to himself, rushing across the ballroom. Teresa was on the hotel terrace, far from the bright lights and muffled sounds of the party that still carried on. The cold wind blew against her face, bringing with it a hollow calm. She leaned on the railing, gazing at the city lights below, losing herself in them. The knot in her throat threatened to tighten further, but she wouldn't cry. Not here. Not after everything. "Why did I agree to this?" she whispered to herself, as if the wind might offer an answer. "Teresa." Daniel's voice cut through the silence. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and straightened up before turning around. Daniel appeared at the terrace door, his face marked by nervousness and fatigue. He stopped for a moment, just looking at her, as if seeing her there, so calm and distant, made him hesitate. "What are you doing here?" she asked, crossing her arms. Her voice was firm, but without the force it had earlier. "I came because I need to talk to you," he replied, his breathing still uneven. Teresa didn't move. She just stared at him, waiting. Daniel walked to the middle of the terrace, but kept a respectful distance between them. The silence stretched, and he had to find courage somewhere deep within himself. "I screwed everything up, didn't I?" he finally asked. "You did," Teresa replied bluntly. "And you didn't even notice when you did it." Daniel ran a hand through his hair, the gesture heavy with frustration. I know you're right. I brought you here, thinking I could control everything, that I could handle tonight on my own. But the truth is, from the moment we walked in, you were the only one who actually made a difference." Teresa raised an eyebrow, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. "It didn't seem that way when you let that woman humiliate me." "I should have defended you sooner," he admitted, his shoulders slumping. "I should have stopped it all. Clarissa knew how to get to me, and I let her win." Teresa looked away, turning her gaze back to the city lights. "She did win, Daniel. She won because you listened to her. Because deep down, you also believed I didn't belong there." "No," he responded quickly, stepping a little closer. "No, I don't believe that. Not anymore." Teresa turned to him, her eyes full of challenge. "And what made you change your mind?" Daniel was silent for a moment, trying to find the words. "You. Everything you did tonight. Everything you said. You made Miller listen. You made him pay attention to something that really matters. And I was too blind to see your worth before tonight." She stared at him, the anger in her eyes beginning to fade. There was something new there, a recognition that hadn't existed before. "And now?" she asked, her voice softer. "Now, we're going to finish what we started," Daniel said, with a determined tone. "I'm not letting Miller leave without hearing what truly matters, and I need your help." Teresa remained silent, watching him. For a moment, she didn't know if she believed him. But then she saw something in Daniel's eyes. Truth. For the first time that night, he was speaking sincerely. She took a deep breath and sighed. "If we're going to do this, Daniel, I don't want to be treated like a symbol or an accessory in your story. If we're going to finish this, it will be as equals." Daniel nodded, without hesitation. "As equals?" Teresa allowed a small smile to appear on her lips, almost imperceptible. "Then what are we waiting for?" They returned to the ballroom, now mostly empty, but enough for them to spot Miller near the entrance, speaking with a few other guests before leaving. Teresa and Daniel walked side by side, their steps purposeful. Clarissa, still lingering nearby, saw them pass and raised an eyebrow in surprise. "Well, look at that! Back for another show." Daniel ignored her, and Teresa didn't even glance her way. When they reached Miller, he looked at them with curiosity, his expression neutral. "Mr. Mueller," Daniel began firmly, "before you leave, I need to ask you to listen to us one more time." Mueller crossed his arms, observing them with interest. "One more time. I've heard enough for tonight." Teresa stepped forward. "You've heard, but not everything. I know you're looking for something that works, something that lasts. We know how to do that, not with empty numbers or grand promises, but with something real, with what the land teaches us." Miller raised an eyebrow, visibly intrigued. Clarissa watched with a look of disbelief, but Teresa and Daniel stood firm, together. The investor asks to hear more details, and Daniel and Teresa smile at each other, hopeful. The hall was almost empty when Daniel and Teresa finally sat down at the small table in front of Miller. The investor, always serious, seemed interested, but it was impossible to decipher what was going through his mind. The only certainty was the heavy silence hanging between them. Teresa adjusted herself in her chair, feeling the mounting pressure but remaining firm. She took a deep breath, glancing at Daniel, who nodded almost imperceptibly. It was as if, for the first time that night, they were in sync, connected by a common purpose. Miller clasped his hands on the table and looked at both of them. "You have 10 minutes. Impress me." Daniel opened the folder he carried, spreading some diagrams and documents on the table. Although his voice sounded controlled, there was a different gleam in his eyes. "Mr. Muller, what we want to present is a real and feasible solution. Teresa and I believe that the land you wish to develop can be transformed into sustainable, vibrant, and thriving spaces by applying natural techniques that respect the environment." Miller didn't respond immediately, merely sliding his eyes over the papers. "That sounds very nice, Lancaster, but I hear a lot of pretty promises. What sets you apart?" Before Daniel could respond, Teresa leaned forward, her voice low but filled with confidence. "Because the beauty here isn't just in the promise, Mr. Miller. It's in the simplicity of what we offer. Spaces that grow and regenerate on their own, without relying on expensive and unsustainable interventions. The land already knows what to do. We just need to listen to it." Miller turned his gaze to her, intrigued. "And what do you know about the land, Miss Teresa?" She smiled faintly, her gaze steady. "I know because I work with it every day. I see what neglect does to gardens, plants, and life. I know that a truly beautiful space is one that sustains itself. Not with chemicals, not with artifice, just with respect." Miller leaned back in his chair, his face still expressionless, but his eyes shone with curiosity. "Explain to me how this would work," he requested. Teresa picked up one of the diagrams in front of her and pointed with her finger, guiding the explanation. "Here, we start with native plants. They require less water and adapt easily to the environment. Then, we create ecological corridors that help preserve biodiversity, attracting bees, birds, and insects that keep the system balanced. Additionally, rainwater can be reused for irrigation, eliminating waste and costs." Daniel complimented, more confident than before. "This not only reduces long-term costs, but also adds value to the project. Investors and clients want spaces that are not just beautiful, but that also convey a message. And today, sustainability is more than a trend. It's a necessity." Muller kept his gaze on them for a long moment. Finally, he offered a subtle, almost imperceptible, but genuine smile. "I must admit, I didn't expect to hear this tonight," he confessed. I must say, Miss Teresa, your knowledge is impressive." Teresa blushed slightly but maintained her posture. "Thank you, Mr. Miller." She paused, her gaze calm but intense. "What we are proposing is not just a project. It's a seed, one that can grow strong and true if planted in the right place." Daniel looked at her, surprised and admiring the quiet strength of her words. Miller seemed to reflect on this for a moment before standing. "Very well." He extended his hand to Daniel. "I will consider your proposal. Send me the figures, and we'll discuss the next steps." Daniel shook his hand firmly, feeling relief course through his body. "Thank you, Mr. Miller. You won't regret it." Miller looked at Teresa once more and nodded, a gesture of respect. "I hope you continue to surprise me, Miss Teresa. Good evening." With that, he left the hall, followed by the other businessmen. The silence that remained was deafening. Daniel exhaled deeply and turned to Teresa, a tired but sincere smile appearing on his face. "You were incredible," he said without hesitation. Teresa smiled back, more relaxed now. "I didn't do anything you couldn't have done." "No," You did much more than that." He looked at her for a moment, as if truly seeing her for the first time. "Without you, tonight would have been a disaster." She shrugged, teasing. "Next time you need saving, don't wait until the last minute to call me." The two laughed together, the light sound finally breaking the tension that had accompanied them all night. The hall was almost empty when they walked together through the main corridor. The hotel lights seemed softer now, and the night outside was clear and starry. Teresa stopped for a moment, looking at the illuminated garden. "It feels like a dream," she said softly. Daniel stopped beside her, observing the same scene. "Which part?" "All of it." She smiled. "I didn't imagine tonight would end like this." He looked at her, his eyes softer than ever. "Neither did I. But sometimes, the best things happen at the most unlikely moments." Teresa lowered her gaze, a little flustered, but then suddenly extended her hand to him. "Come, I want to show you something." Daniel frowned, but allowed her to pull him along the stone path to the hotel's small garden. The rustling of leaves sounded like a whisper around them, and the soft wind carried the perfume of flowers. "Look," Teresa said, stopping by a flower bed. She knelt and pointed to small green leaves sprouting from the soil. "These are new. Someone cared for them. But the work is only just beginning." Daniel watched in silence, a genuine smile appearing on his lips. "Like everything in life, isn't it?" he murmured. "Growth takes time?" Teresa looked at him, surprised by his words. Then she smiled too. "Yes, but with the right care, everything blooms." They stood in silence for a moment, gazing at the garden under the starlight. Teresa extended her hand to help Daniel up, and he accepted. When they straightened, the two shared a long, meaningful look, something new growing between them. "You should visit my garden someday," Teresa said suddenly. "I'm sure I could teach you a few things." Daniel laughed, his eyes shining with a lightness he hadn't felt in years. "As long as I don't have to get my hands too dirty." Teresa smiled, shaking her head. "You'll have to learn." They began walking side by side, leaving the garden behind. The wind blew gently, making the leaves dance like a silent applause. As they walk away, the rustling leaves in the garden sound like soft applause. The audience is left with the certainty that something new and true has just begun to bloom. If you enjoyed this story, don't miss the next one. Just click on the screen.